This episode of The Breach Show contains conversations about police violence and sexual assault that could be triggering or upsetting for some listeners. Please take care if you choose to proceed. Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Last year was one of the most deadly in recent memory for police use of force in Canada. A new report from the Tracking Injustice Project shows a sustained pattern of police killing civilians without any legal consequences. Now, The Breach has obtained an advance copy of the report, and it got us thinking more broadly about police power, about invasive surveillance powers that police have, and also about the lack of accountability for police officers who are caught doing harm. So, to break all of that down with us today, I'm joined by a co-host who is no stranger here. Al Jones is a professor of politics at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, a former poet laureate, an activist for prison justice, and the author of several works, including the 2022 book, Abolitionist Intimacies. Welcome back, Al.
Thank you, Desmond.
You're welcome. And as we get started, just a reminder to our audiences, please take a second now to like and subscribe for more bold journalism for transformation. All right, Al, let's start with the latest from the Tracking Injustice report. This is an Ottawa-based project that tracks death involving police use of force in Canada. I'm going to share some major findings. Between 2000 and 2014, there were an average of 24 police-involved deaths per year, but today we are seeing upwards of 50 police-involved deaths per year, with 62 deaths in 2022, 51 in 2023, 51 again in 2024, and 61 last year in 2025. The year 2022 had the highest number of police-involved deaths ever recorded, with 2025 last year as the second highest year. So we know from Tracking Injustice that of 266 deaths investigated in the last 5 years, 96% of investigations into these deaths ended with no charges being laid against the police. So obviously that means only 4% led to charges or recommendations of charges, and the majority of those were later dropped. We also know from Tracking Injustice that about 30%, at least 30% of people killed by the police between 2020 and 2025 were understood to be unarmed. And finally, we also know from this report that racial disparities in who the police kill persist. If you combine the Indigenous and Black population in Canada, it makes up just over 10% of Canada's population, but it accounts for 27% of those identified in police shooting deaths. Elle, you and I have unfortunately been studying numbers like this for a really long time. I want to just get your first impressions on everything I just shared there.
None of that is surprising, and we've seen these kind of numbers steadily climbing in a number of reports. So whether that's been things around strip searches, uses of force, deaths in custody, deaths by police, we've continually seen a steady increase in those numbers, which also go alongside the increased numbers of police funding and the increased amount of arms that police are getting. So as police get more weapons, as they have the ability to deploy more force, they unsurprisingly also use more force. What we've also seen since 2020 is after that brief period of interest in deaths by police, we have seen very little media coverage. In fact, what we saw, of course, is the inevitable backlash to people actually talking about the police, and particularly the movement for Black Lives and the interest in deaths of Black and Indigenous people by police. And we saw that followed up by an outsized amount of media coverage on the so-called deadliest year for police, if you remember that, which was probably 2022, which is actually the deadliest year period for people in encounters with police. But that got spun by the media into hyper coverage of police funerals. And ever since then, we really haven't seen any attention at all to this issue. So this is one of the things that's become background noise, but is in fact increasing and is met by public myths around things like we actually defunded the police, which we didn't. All the police budgets have gone up. And since we supposedly defunded the police can no longer do their jobs. And the police are actually the ones facing violence. So this massive projection of what is actually happening, which is increased budgets, increased policing, more arms and equipment and surveillance powers, etc., to police, and an unsurprising result that we are seeing more use of force and more people dying and being harmed as a result. And one of the things the report addresses is the lack of transparency around police shooting deaths. So whether that's the refusal to reveal officer names, the burying of discipline records, the inability to receive things like footage, investigative reports given to the family members. So there's a stunning, I mean, not surprising, but stunning lack of information that takes place and a lack of transparency around that as well, which also allows for the police to basically control this narrative and shift the grounds in which they talk about policing. So the police have very successfully turned our conversation on policing to largely being about hate crimes, for example, right? Like that's the most discussion we have about policing right now is protest policing, hate crimes, etc., which is also a thing on the left. Like we talk about this a lot because we're the ones being affected, right? Like, but in having this conversation about the way the police using their powers, like for example, in the over-policing of protests, it has allowed the deadly force of police to go relatively unnoticed and untalked about as well.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, Joe, because this country is obsessed with the United States of America. And because of the murder of George Floyd being, a high profile issue around the world, that forced some conversations that we needed to have in Canada that we were not having. Even though policing is killing more people in Canada, we've never really wanted to talk about it. And so there's no kind of, can we pivot from the United States to be like, and what about Canada? Which is what we always tend to want to do in this country. Keeping that momentum that was built after the killing of George Floyd, talking about police deaths in Canada, Aisha Hudson in Winnipeg, talking about DeAndre Campbell and Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto. There were a lot of conversations here, but I think that it was because we always like putting our issues alongside those of the United States, comparing and contrasting ourselves with the Americans. And to the extent that that has not become the biggest issue anymore and the backlash to BLM in the United States has happened, I feel like, yeah, the same thing has happened here.
And what we're talking about obviously is the calling for, more police to police synagogues. Like, the protests, we need more police to do that. We have to keep neighborhoods safe with police. And when Black people are like, actually, we've already had this conversation and more policing doesn't keep people safe, we are now accused of being the ones endangering people. So there's this projection where those who have for many, many years carefully, systematically uncovered exactly what happens when you invest in police and the backlash for all communities. Because again, racial profiling stuff, yes, it impacts Black people, but what we always see is that kind of policing also impacts everybody, right? Unaccountable policing impacts everybody. White people get profiled and stopped too, right? Just not to the extent that we do. What's important to understand is policing issues are domestic, but they're also deeply connected to these global trends as well, right? Like it's not disconnected from the idea that Canada's investing more in border security, that Carney just announced $2.6 billion to be spent on missiles that can only be manufactured in the US. That's not disconnected, right? It's a growing ideology of force and security that we're seeing on all fronts at the border in terms of Canada needs a better military and security. We need to spend more money on NATO. And that also backlashes into like, we need this force abroad at the border and we need this force internally as well. So this is part of the same mechanism where our entire culture right now is really focused on authoritarianism, fascism, more police, more weapons, more policing of people, more border security, more everything. And of course, at the same time, we're in a food crisis, a housing crisis, a poverty crisis, an inflation crisis, etc. And that's not disconnected.
Yeah, I think another challenge of the many, Elle, is that you don't have to die in Canada to be harmed by the police. And so we really need reports like this, but they don't capture the entire scope of policing. It takes someone being killed by our police or dying in their custody for news to even have the opportunity to pierce through. But the everyday violence that is policing kind of seems to become more normalized. And that's so often what we're fighting against. And to that end, Elle, actually, I want to talk about the fact that the Tracking Injustice Project even needs to exist in its purest form. Because our governments don't require Canadian police to track and report broadly on injuries and deaths involving the police. And different jurisdictions handle and report on and even collect this data differently. They investigate police differently across different jurisdictions. So what could be a crime in one place is not necessarily in another. And the report notes this as a serious problem. So, what can we understand from the refusal, the ongoing refusal of our governments not to collect this data, even as policing becomes more deadly in the country?
As I recall, tracking injustice, I believe it got started during COVID and it was tracking like COVID based arrests, if I remember correctly. And then they also have, they track deaths in custody as well and deaths in prison, and they track this. So, what they're, as a sort of general project, is all these areas where data isn't being kept or tracked or paid attention to. And yeah, I mean, the argument will be that policing is municipal, it's also provincial, like the only federal police, is the RCMP, not that they like have any accountability there either. So this mishmash of policing, like for example, in Halifax, where I am, we're dually policed. We're policed by HRP, like Halifax Regional Police, and we're policed by the RCMP, and that actually allows that kind of overlap allows them to sort of push things off onto each other, and people themselves aren't necessarily even aware of which force they're dealing with and what the jurisdiction is, and that confusion benefits the police. But yes, like the idea that we have all this data about XYZ, and then the most basic data around like the police are killing people. We don't have that, but we also can't get access to things like disciplinary records. CBC has in the past taken the police to court and had to go through the information ombudsman because they refuse to give information that's asked for, even when they're supposed to. People like Scott Wortley, who have done a lot of these reports, like use of force reports, racial profiling reports, have said in those reports that many times they don't even get the information back from forces. So even when they're mandated to give this kind of information, they simply don't. And there's not really a mechanism to force them. So the police live in those gaps. Like that's what they do on purpose, while they use the police unions, of course, to put out an endless stream of propaganda, whether that's like police dog funerals or police funerals, or where our morale is low and someone would put ACAB graffiti and that makes us feel sad and we're so stressed out because we have to protest go to all these protests and people are mean to us, right? Like they always have the time to have access to the media and create this narrative, and they have no time to do actually what they're supposed to be doing.
I want to share an account from a family. One of the great things about the Tracking Injustice report is that it doesn't just have data, it has some personal accounts from family who have had loved ones taken from us by the police and who talk about the process that happened, particularly around oversight. So this is an account from somebody who's called Mary in the report, the sister of a deceased person in a death involving the police. And Mary's talking about what happened in the investigation after her sibling was killed. So what actually happened was the local police, who, by the way, the minute that police kill somebody and the a mandate of the oversight body is enacted, the local police force is under investigation. So they're not supposed to be doing anything anymore because their behavior is being scrutinized. But what the police often do is that they do continue as acting as though we're in charge of this scene where we just killed somebody or where someone has died in front of us, died in our custody, died as a result of our actions, which they should not be doing. In Mary's case, as you're about to hear, they actually were questioning her and her family after being involved in the death of her sibling. I'm going to quote from it. And they're asking questions of what happened that morning. They're interviewing us. And then we get a knock on the door, and these two other men come in and say, "We're from the oversight agency." But after an exchange, the oversight investigators allow the local police officers, who we just found out at that point after an hour were from the local police force, they allowed them to stay. And the oversight investigators left. I said, "Is there no independent investigation? Are you guys from the local police?" And they're like, "Yes, yes, yes." And I'm like, "Are there no independent people?" And they said, "Yeah, the guys who just came in for a second, they're the independent people." And then I started to think, okay, this is wrong. So that's an account from somebody whose sibling died in an encounter with the police. And then those same police begin question. And I've heard this before from families, Al. I have seen this in action. And I think it demonstrates the real challenge when the police have so much power and nothing obviously happens to them for engaging in practices like the one that we just heard about.
Yeah, not only that, but they'll often threaten or at least subtly threaten families or people inquiring. So not only controlling the scene and the questioning, but as things move along, so families have experienced when they ask for answers, being sort of told like you could be charged, or we're only because we're being nice, like we're not charging you, and like this long power relationship that takes place. The police also have legal representation. Families don't, so they have to seek that representation. They're not entitled to any representation because they're not actors in, like, the family doesn't count for anything. So these families become victimized in multiple ways by the police at the scene, by the so-called independent investigative process, which never yields anything or very rarely yields anything. Meanwhile, the police, of course, have the media, they have the politicians, they have a police chief, they have an administrative response. They get their lawyers paid for by the union. They get the best representation. So it's a completely imbalanced system in all ways. And of course, families can't get justice. Then you add in the stigma that the person's criminalized. They're going to be, oh, they were on drugs. Oh, they had a record. They had a warrant, etc., etc. Even if true or not, that will be used to stigmatize the person. And often, of course, they come from a situation where they don't have resources to mobilize and the ability to navigate the systems.
I just want to ask, on the specific point of knowing that most of these investigations that we're talking about here and that Mary outlines in her story, knowing that most of those investigations do not result in any charges against the police, do you believe in the idea of civilian oversight? Do we need to get rid of the agencies that currently investigate police, many of which are staffed with former police officers, and have a fully civilian oversight process for these kinds of situations?
Yeah, as you said, like in Halifax again, because we have like Halifax Regional Police and RCMP, they just, if it's an RCMP shooting, the Halifax Regional Police investigates them. If it's Halifax Regional Police, the RCMP is put on, and that's what's called independent investigating.
Well, you also have CERT, that's the Serious Incident Response Team.
But like when you look at who's on this, like either retired cops or it's people from like literally the police force, or they go across the border, right? So like Nova Scotia cops will investigate in New Brunswick, or Quebec cops will be brought in. So what they're calling independent isn't as in an independently trained body of like legally trained people, like say lawyers or investigators who have separate training, who then staff this body and are brought in a challenge for conflict of interest, right? Like that's not what happens. It's literally, and in fact, the expertise, it's considered that you only have expertise if you have expertise in policing, right? Like experience in policing. So former police are actually given like far more credit because, oh, well, you can't possibly understand policing because you weren't a cop. So here, for example, when they brought in African Nova Scotians to allegedly, like vet these reports from our so-called like investigative unit, CERT, they have spoken up about how they have completely sidelined. They asked for things like tape. They asked to see statements, and they're just not given it. Yet then that will be touted as, well, we had the African Nova Scotian community like involved in this report. They signed off on it, but they actually aren't. They're not given any powers. They're not able to challenge. They're not able to do their own questioning. Another example, like in New Brunswick, there's been a number of shootings of Mi'kmaq people. In one case, the community already had set up like alternate policing for domestic violence. So they already had in place in the community an alternate response. The police completely did not like use that. So there was a domestic case. The police showed up, shot the person, and the band is saying, but we already have crisis intervention. We have like literally set up stuff in this community to deal with this situation. And the police simply ignore it. And then when the Mi'kmaq community is like, well, we want a Mi'kmaq-led investigative process, they're also denied that. So no matter at which point you try to intervene in this and say, like, beforehand, we've set this up, we have crisis intervention, we have our own response, we want, we already have this situation where we have people in place that are supposed to talk to police. If the police don't want to deal with it, they don't.
The full Tracking Injustice report is going to be out on Tuesday, June 9th, and Tracking Injustice is going to hold a press conference in Ottawa. Elle, I want to move on to another policing issue federally, which is surveillance. And a bill called C-22, the so-called Lawful Access Bill that is moving through Parliament right now. This is the Liberals' second attempt at passing this surveillance bill. And the biggest provisions in it include, I guess, two really big things. The first one is that our police and spy agencies like CSIS are asking the government to give them a back door to your encrypted information in places like social media and your phone. So you send messages to other people, you send texts, you send direct messages. They're all encrypted. But let's say the government wants to investigate you for something. They would like to have a little side door in, Facebook or X or Instagram or your text messages to be able to kind of get in the middle of those two conversations and see what's being said. This is unprecedented. It doesn't happen in most other countries. And this is something that the government has been contemplating to great criticism, I must say. And then the other big thing about C-22 is about metadata, which is kind of like who you talk to, how long you talk to them. And all of this information, when collected by authorities, can paint a really detailed picture of your life. I want to quote Supriya Dwivedi from TVO talking about this. I think she explains it very clearly. I'll quote her. As written, C-22 would compel service providers to retain metadata for up to a year. That means there would be a record of every person you contacted and who contacted you, how long you talked for, on what device, as well as a complete picture of your movements, including locations one might want to keep private, like protests or medical appointments. So the Liberals tried to put this into law in a bill called C2 last year. There was so much criticism of it, Elle, that they said, okay, we're going to try again. And that's this new incarnation of C-22. What do you think about these powers of surveillance that the police are seeking?
Well, first of all, don't you think if you have to call your bill the lawful access bill, that suggests that there's unlawful access going on? Like that kind of seems like a methinks they doth protest too much type title. Like
Paging George Orwell.
yeah, this time it's really legal. Um, so at a time when we should actually be like more intent than ever on protecting our data, precisely because we've seen how these movements and stuff in the most obviously like extreme situations can be used to literally target and kill people. Our government is trying to actually get access to it. Now, why does this matter? I mean, first of all, because like one of the things is, of course, they want access to things like our encrypted platforms like Signal, etc. Like these are the platforms that are used for organizing. We've seen in Canada that, as in everywhere else, that things like designating people as terrorists is not some kind of, again, we're talking about transparency. This is not a transparent process, right? Like when they designate Samidoun a terrorist organization, it's not like there's a real process here and you have to and you get to present evidence and defend yourself, right? Like if the government designates you, for example, a terrorist group, and we know that this spy on Indigenous activists, we've seen this, like massive surveillance of Indigenous land activists. We know that historically the people have been declared the biggest threats to security have been environmental activists, Indigenous activists, Black
Anti-police
activists,
activists, yeah.
animal activists, right? Like these are the people that actually get designated under this. And so it would be completely naive to think that, when they say, oh, but this is for extremity, it's to fight terrorism, it's for security. Yeah, but you can call my group a terrorist group anytime you want because somebody allegedly flew a flag at a protest or allegedly gave some money to a group you don't like or whatever you want to claim, unsavory associations. And then that's going to give you access to all these platforms, to all our data, to everyone we talk to. So, I mean, it's clearly the security risk is to organizing. And particularly, of course, to the same communities that, as always, are the ones that are surveyed and profiled, right? There's a long history. Like we literally just had yet another round of it being revealed that they were spying on Indigenous activists. They spied on Black activists from the 1960s onwards. You were spied on, like you were surveyed. Like this is not ancient history. This is happening right now.
Yeah, there is a CBC article going back several years about myself and members of Black Lives Matter being watched by the police here in Toronto. In this case, groups like Meta and X and Google are actually pushing back against C22. They don't want it because they want to be able to guarantee to their consumers that when you send messages, no one else can see them. It's not good for their product to actually have a back door or a side door like this to go around encryption. And I will add that once you create that pathway for, say, law enforcement or CSIS to go in and look at messages around the encryption, that means that a hacker can go in there and do the exact same thing through that same channel. That means that a foreign government can go in there and do the exact same thing through the same channel.
Yeah, and I mean, like, our if you like what's on our phones, our banking apps, our credit cards, like all of our information. We take a picture of our license, our health card, our SIM cards, like the amount of information we probably stupidly, stack onto our phones, but that's just what the convenience is. And as you said, like it's not like this backdoor exists and then the police will only use it in extremely vetted ways with a warrant from the court in this particular way. And like they're never, ever, ever going to abuse that. And no one else is going, like it's absurd, right? And so companies like Signal have said, well, then we simply won't operate in Canada because like we cannot have a product where we tell people this is encrypted and safe, except over here. Like now there's a back door. It doesn't make the product viable. And so they've literally said that they won't be operating if this is the case. And again, yeah, like I'll give an example where, so Randy Riley's wrongful conviction, which I talk about in my book, which we've talked about frequently together. Phone data was initially used in that case to incriminate him, falsely. So, because as it turns out, a lot of this data is like, if you watch TV, you think that, when the cops bring data to court, it's airtight. In reality, it's terrible data. And they just said, many things in a very significant voice to convince the jury that, this proved he was near the scene where he wasn't. And then they actually, when that didn't work because he had an appeal, actually in his bail hearing, they used these wiretaps they had. And he was saying, somebody who was trying to get information from him, he was saying like, I don't know anything. I ain't lying. And they somehow used that to try and argue that because he said, I ain't lying, that meant that he knew he was lying. And he wouldn't say, I ain't lying, if you actually didn't know something. Like, just the most convoluted arguments. And I want to say two more things. One is I want to take us back to Bill C-51, which I was looking up yesterday and remembering that. So obviously post 9/11.
Remind people quickly, about
yeah, like
C-51.
This is the exact same thing where they wanted to designate in the name of terrorism, right? This is under Harper. And they wanted access to things like our library cards, like, like similar kind of idea. And this was comprehensively at the time. There was a number of papers, people like Kent Roach, that like shot this down and talked about the dangers of this surveillance, the dangers of designating people as terrorists. Like we already saw this with the no-fly lists and how absurd that was. And there's still people on those lists to this day. So we've already had this discussion with Bill C-51, and now we're bringing it back, but like updated for new technology and pretending that the very same charter issues that people already discussed and comprehensively like debunked don't apply now. So this is just really Bill C-51 done again, which proves that Carney is further right than Harper, right? Like, which is the other thing that's going on is like liberals still seem to be enamored with Carney, the adult in the room, as again, his elbows up gives money to the US for funding weapons as he takes positions that are literally just rewarmed Harper. So if this doesn't show us that, it should.
I think one of the challenges of talking about surveillance is that talking about it gives you the ick. It just makes you feel paranoid and scared about this overwhelming force that you seemingly don't even know is acting on you and seemingly have no power to stop. But the fact that C2 had to be split up into this bill. So the fact that the things that the government wanted to do that we're talking about last year were defeated and that they're bringing it back now in C-22 because so many groups and individuals and privacy interests and corporations even too, quite frankly, said, this is not on, you cannot do this. I think that that's an important lesson to take out of this. It's not like the government can go into your private affairs anytime it wants to, however it wants to, and that you as an individual have no recourse against it. We clearly do have recourse against it, and governments clearly get wary when we start sounding the alarm and saying that they are stripping us of our privacy. They respond to that. And I think when you talk also, Elle, about demonstrations and protests being criminalized, Most of the charges, at least when we're dealing with a place like Toronto, where there's been huge criminalization in the last couple of years of Palestine solidarity demonstrations, the vast, vast, vast majority of these charges do not result in a conviction. And they are tossed out or there's a deal made before it gets to that point. My theory that I think, I want to believe is quite well founded for the reason that that happens is that the police don't actually want to show us their work. They don't want to show us the really bogus investigative practices that they're using or the sloppy forms of so-called evidence that they're collecting in court where it would be scrutinized, where they would have to be cross-examined on it, where police would have to sit on the stand and be cross-examined. They don't want to do that. And I know we have to go further than just like the law and what the charter allows for us. But when we're talking about new laws like this, I don't want people to believe that there's no recourse. There's absolutely ways that we push back and that governments and law enforcement have to respond to. Elle, I want to get to now a story out of Toronto which has made international headlines because it's an international story involving three police officers who allegedly assaulted a sex worker in a taxi cab in Spain while they were vacationing there, who have now been sent back to Canada but are continuing to be under investigation by police in Spain, who are suspended with pay for the time being. That could change as the investigations continue. I actually just want to read the names of the three officers who are charged in this case in Spain because the police fought so hard to not tell us who they are. They are Evan Glennie, Rich Rand, and Calgar Yigit, all three of them Toronto police officers of varying levels of experience. A couple of them have received awards and citations from the Toronto police, so make of that what you will. But I think one of the more shocking details of this story is that when two, at least, of these officers were confronted in public by the Spanish police, they took out their Toronto police badges and flashed them as if to say, oh, no, 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 it's fine. We're cops. You're suspecting us of assaulting somebody? Well, but we're cops, though. That obviously didn't work out for them the way that they hoped for. But that particular detail of that story in an environment in Toronto where police corruption is being exposed basically now on like a weekly basis, I think that even that was shocking to people. And it caused politicians who almost never talk about individual policing instances to have to come out and clarify that they were very concerned about this, that this is unacceptable, that the officers should face consequences if they're found guilty of charges. It forced the police association to come out and try to cover and say, well, they were off duty, so we don't have to tell you too much about the situation and we're not going to talk about it a lot. But even down to the fact, Al, that these three officers, whose names we now know, were not initially named in the media, and that there was a big job being done by the Toronto police to try and not tell us what their names were, even though they're charged with these serious crimes. It's really put the lack of accountability of individual police for individual actions back into focus. What's your view listening to this really wild story out of Toronto?
First of all, because the police chief had to come out and specifically he talked about them flashing their badges. And that reminds me of that Norm Macdonald bit. Remember that Norm Macdonald bit where someone's like, the worst part about it is, he said, I think the worst part was the raping. Remember that Norm Macdonald line where people be like, the worst part is that they abused their badge. It's like, no, I think the worst part was that they sexually assaulted a woman, right? Like that's what it reminds me of. Because it's interesting that the police keep calling, the police chief is like this inappropriate behavior. And it's like, so you're mad about the badge because it makes the Toronto police look bad, but you're not actually mad that your officers, or don't seem to be as mad, that your officers sexually assaulted a woman in a taxi cab, like 3 officers on 1 woman, right? So I find that interesting that the focus becomes on like the police abuse of power and not the fact that they actually assaulted somebody. So can we like pause on that, right? Like, so that woman falls out of what actually happened and it becomes about like all this discussion about like internationally, should they be like they were allowed to go home. And I'm not saying those things shouldn't be discussed, but I just find it, again, interesting how, again, the police always manage to switch the narrative from the actual violent crime into everything around it, and it becomes about optics and PR and not about the violence. I mean, also, what's probably notable is the World Cup is in Canada like this summer. So Toronto police are like literally now in charge of so-called policing the world, right? Like we're welcoming the world to Toronto to the World Cup. And so these same police that can't go a day, as you said, without getting caught in some corruption scandal, including like literally, again, being allegedly sexually assaulting a woman, are going to be out in force, like policing these football games. And then we also have like ICE coming in, which we've been assured that, oh, well, no, they won't have any investigative capacities. Well, then why are they coming? So it also illustrates, like, all these police are getting exchanged across all these countries. They flash their badges. Like, in their minds, they are policing. So what happens when ICE comes into Canada and wants to abduct somebody, beat someone, rape someone, and is going to flash their badge in the same way? Like, you know what I mean? Like, this idea that the border matters. So it's interesting that, like, they're Schrodinger's cops, right? So when cops are undercover and then they chase you down and beat you up, if you don't know they're undercover, as happened in a Toronto case where they jumped out at that, what was his name? The man they jumped out and he ran over them because he was scared because he thought they were a gang and it was
That's
cops.
Umar Zamir.
Right. So in that case, the mayor will come out and be like, oh, this is disgusting. Like, that man should be prosecuted to the full extent. And you're like, I didn't even know they were cops. And they're like, well, we just are cops. Like, we just are cops. We're always cops. If we chase you down and beat you up so you lose an eye and we're off duty, we're cops. And like, you ran away from cops. Like, we were cops. And then they're like, oh, we raped somebody off duty. Oh, we weren't cops. We flashed our badge, but we weren't cops. Like, this isn't actually a policing issue because they weren't acting as cops in that moment. So like, make a choice. When are you cops? Are you always cops?
I'm so glad you bring that up. I'm so glad you bring that up because I think that that's one of the things that this story illustrates. When is a cop a cop? When is a police officer on duty? When do they have the powers of a police officer? For me, Al, I don't know what you think. Maybe we think similarly about this. It doesn't really make a practical difference once you get that badge and that weapon and all of the protections when you swear the oath. You are always a cop. You are always a cop to me because you will use, as you have illustrated, the powers of policing to your advantage when it suits you. So we can't allow, I don't think, people with that much authority to then be able to say, well, yes, but I was off duty. You were off duty in another country with your badge because you knew
like,
that badge meant something.
Badge?
Why did you take your badge?
Like, you're going on vacation, you're like, I need my passport, I need my badge. Like, and also, like, it's kind of
how often does that work, by the way? How often
do the Spanish police like know how to tell, like, if it's an authentic like Toronto police badge as opposed to something that like didn't we have a mass shooter who was like faking police uniforms and stuff? Like,
Portapique, Nova Scotia.
Weren't the Toronto police like selling uniforms? Isn't that part of the corruption scandal? So you're actually like, I'm going to go overseas with this badge and that's somehow going to be authenticated by this police. Like, couldn't I flash a dollar store badge too and be like, oh, I'm a cop?
But you see, Elle, this is what gets to the soul of it because we see ICE doing this in the United States too, where they're going everywhere in balaclavas without uniforms on. And then the next thing you know, men who realize, hey, I could probably get away with that as well, are doing the same thing. And they're just going to people's houses. They have weapons. They look like they're police officers, but they're not. And I think that this extends all the way down to things like wanting transit police to be armed, wanting transit police in Toronto. We had a proposal under John Tory to have undercover transit police. So some goon in no uniform is going to come up to you while you're sitting on the bus and ask you to prove that you paid. And when you say, who are you? He doesn't have to show you because he's not even wearing a uniform. Anyone can take advantage of these kinds of situations. It's just so dangerous.
The real thing that we haven't been asked to think about is, so these men went to Spain, presumably to hire a sex worker, and brought their badges. So who were they trying to intimidate with those badges? Right? Like, what was the purpose of that badge? Because they didn't think they were going to get caught, right? So who was that badge for? Do you think that they perhaps take their badges to go and intimidate the local woman? I'm a cop, do this for me, or, right? Like, that's what really scares me, is like, How are these cops engaging in like so-called sex tourism and bringing their badges? Like they had to. It's not like, oh, oops, it was just like in my pocket. Like you had it on purpose, and I don't think the reason why they had it was because they expected they were going to get caught. I think they had it because of the activities they were planning on undergoing when they were in Spain that they got caught doing. And like I don't see anybody talking about that. Like, what's more of a threat to Canadian security? Like a bunch of people in a signal group talking about like what to paint on the banners, or cops trafficking their badges across borders in order to engage in sexual assault, right? Like, and again, this is like what the security regime is. Like, this is what it is. This is not bad apples. This is what it is. And the more immunity and power that we see globally and locally handed to police, yeah, like this is not. So, I mean, I don't know why we're acting shocked, but I feel extremely sorry for this woman because, as we know, like these men are not in Spain anymore. Like, what's the likelihood that they actually return to face trial? What's the likelihood the charges aren't dropped? What's the likelihood that there won't be pressure put on her? Is she really going to hang around to testify when she's already like marginalized and vulnerable? Like, and we're not even going to talk about her because it just becomes, one more part of this like police scandal for optics of the police and like how do the police reform themselves.
We started this conversation saying that we were having these conversations for real 5 and 6 years ago. They were part of the mainstream chat, and they have left the chat because the circumstances in the world has changed. Policing has done a very good job of trying to kind of rewrite the script and divert our attention elsewhere. But for example, every municipality in Ontario that controls those local police is having an election this year. We're all having municipal elections, and that's where these police budgets that we're talking about are controlled. That's where so-called police oversight in the form of police services boards exist. You authored a report a couple of years ago about defunding, about divesting from policing, taking money out of the massive police budgets that we have and returning it to communities. We've got candidates in 444 municipalities this fall contending for people's votes where policing should be a huge issue given all the things that you and I are talking about today. What advice do you have for candidates who are seeking to run for office and may have the courage to think it's time that we start talking about policing and it's time that policing be on the ballot? How can they go about bringing ideas to actual change and reform?
I feel like the reason why we know that defund was actually a successful campaign was the amount of energy it was spent pretending that defund was a terrible slogan. And it was actually a perfect like slogan because it wasn't even a slogan, it's an action, right? So it's one of the perhaps rare, like when you say free this, it's like, what do you mean by free? Like, what do you mean by defund? Like, it's literally in the name. And so I think like literally it was and is a successful way of speaking. And like people have allowed themselves to pretend that it wasn't, right? That, oh, like we needed to say something else. Like maybe if we had said reallocate, maybe if we had said nicer words. And I think if we've learned anything in the last like 3 years, it's that stop playing the word game. It doesn't matter, right? Like that is just cosmetic. And people always, oh, maybe if you use a different slogan. So people actually just need to come out and say what they want to say it with your full chest, and like don't walk back what you want. Like we were told defunding is so stupid. And remember people saying abolish ICE and that was supposed to be so stupid. And then ICE went and mowed down and killed a bunch of people in the streets. We'd be like, maybe we should get rid of ICE. It's like, oh, you mean abolish ICE? Like you mean that thing you told us was a ridiculous progressive lefty slogan that would like alienate everybody. And now everybody wants to abolish ICE. And what the right is actually good at is they recognize things, but then they don't have solutions, right? The right is actually good at putting their finger on problems and then they come up with the wrong answers, right? Like they're like, okay, yes, like we recognize this discontent, but it's immigrants, right? So what we actually need to do is not pretend that these things aren't issues, like recognize the issues and then full-throatedly, unashamedly, like properly propose these policies. It is not crazy and ridiculous to say, like at a time when we can't afford groceries, the police are being paid overtime to go stand in the grocery store to police people stealing food who they're going to then beat down or even kill. Like in Halifax, a shoplifter got chased and run over by the police, like for taking food, right? That is unacceptable. Putting money into the police doesn't make us safer. It doesn't give us the things we want in community. It empowers the most immune people to continue doing violence. And you may think they're doing that violence to people you don't like, but then it flips back on you. Like, how many times can you say this? Don't give them the money so they have the power to go in your Signal chat and then criminalize you because you and your friends said you were going to a protest. Don't allow them a back door to go into your social media because you don't know when that's going to be used and by who. Stop looking down to the states and pretending that everything evil happens under Trump and can't happen here. Stop holding up Carney as some kind of adult who's a banker who has his hand on like the global statesmanship as he like literally imposes policies that are taking Canada further right than Harper. Like, wake up. Sorry, I sound frustrated, but yes, that is it. Like, we have had these conversations over and over and over. We've been demonized for them, and then we're always proven right. So if anybody's running for office, like, don't be a coward. Like, actually just come out and say with your whole chest what we need, because we are in a crisis. People are like poor, gas, etc., etc., all the things about inflation, work, etc. And we are going to have to stop having armed police like outside a baseball game in the hundreds. Like, that is not what your money needs to be going to. And that cop could like rape somebody or kill somebody and you will never know because their name won't be out there and you won't have their disciplinary record. Like, is that the world you want?
It is exhausting to have these conversations, Elle, but we do it because they are life and death. They are possibility for a different future than the one that we're living. You write about it, you talk about it, you fight for it, and that's why we're always so happy to have you on the show. Thank you so, so much for your insights today.
Thank you, Desmond.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.